Dearest listener, scandal never sleeps. Sit with me by the fire. Do you hear it? The crackle of flame, the sigh of smoke curling toward the rafters. Fires confess the things polite tongues would never dare. Broken vows, love turned venom, promises buried in the dark. At Hawksmere Keep, grief lingers like damp stone. The widow Alianor clings to memory, but the world will not wait for her mourning. Predators circle, powerful men whose laughter hides sharpened teeth. Whispers drift through these halls, of loyalty for sale, of desires too dangerous to name, of secrets so heavy they smother the very air. One choice, one forbidden step, and a lady's fate may be sealed. Not with justice, my darling, but with ruin. This, I assure you, is no history lesson. It is scandal, alive, breathing, etched in ash and ink. And once you hear it, it clings to you, as surely as smoke clings to silk. So lean closer, let the fire warm your hands, even as the tale chills your heart. The scandalous hours have begun. Dearest listener, scandal never sleeps. Tonight, I invite you into the tale of Hawksmere, where widows weep, wolves circle, and secrets drip like candle wax. Lean closer, confidant, for this is the scandalous hours.
And thank you, Lady Aurelia. Welcome to the very first glimpse of Lady Aurelia Ravenshade, presents The Scandalous Hours. I'm Rhonda, your host and guide beyond the veil, bringing Aurelia's scandalous archives to life for you here. In each episode, Lady Aurelia will usher us into her Gothic world while I narrate the tale chapter by chapter, weaving scandal, love, betrayal, and danger in a world where nothing is ever as it seems. This isn't dusty history. This is living, breathing drama.
Scandal, my dear, waits for no one.
Subscribe now and step into the shadows with us. The Scandalous Hours has begun.
Dearest listeners, the night is heavy, the air ripe with secrets, and I, Lady Aurelia Ravenshade, bid you welcome. We stand upon the storm-lashed stones of Hawksmere Keep, where grief clings like damp, and where the widow Alianor de Clervaux finds herself bound not by love, but by chains unseen. Tonight I shall lift the veil and then leave you in the care of another voice, one who will guide you deeper into the shadowed halls. Listen closely, for every whisper carries weight, and every silence hides a threat.
The wind wasn't singing, it was keening, a high, thin, desolate sound that wormed its way through every ill-fitting shutter, every cracked mortar joint in Hawksmere Keep, carrying with it the relentless icy sting of late autumn rain. Outside, the Peak District hills, usually harsh and majestic under a wide sky, were reduced to smudged charcoal sketches behind a persistent gray curtain. Rain lashed the ancient stone walls with the fury of a scorned lover, a constant drumming counterpoint to the mournful wind that found every crevice in the great hall's high, narrow windows. The air inside Hawksmere's great hall hung thick and oppressive, a physical weight. It was a miasma of wet wool steaming near the inadequate hearth, of wood smoke tainted by damp logs struggling to catch, and beneath it all, the lingering, sour tang of grief, a smell like forgotten lilies and cold earth overlaid with the faint, metallic scent of fear. Lady Alianor de Clervaux stood statue still near the massive, soot-blackened fireplace, her back to its meager heat. It did nothing. The ice encasing her heart felt impenetrable, a glacial shelf formed over 4 dismal years and solidified in the past 3 days. Her fingers, unnaturally pale against the coarse, unforgiving black wool of her widow's gown, clenched convulsively around a scrap of damp embroidery, a futile, trembling attempt at occupation. The intricate stitches blurred before her eyes, meaningless knots of colored thread mirroring the tangled mess of her future. Trapped. The word echoed louder than the subdued murmur of the 24 mourners clustered around the trestle tables, picking half-heartedly at the funeral meats laid out with more duty than abundance. Sir Godfrey de Clervaux, her husband, her jailer, lay cold beneath the newly churned, rain-sodden earth of the family plot just beyond the chapel walls. He'd been old enough to be her grandsire, his breath perpetually sour with decay and stale wine, his touch an unwelcome intrusion that had made her skin crawl and her spirit wither, his death, a sudden violent clutching of his chest during a supper of thin pottage, followed by a final wet rattle that seemed to shake the very stones of Hawksmere, should have been a release. A key turning in a rusted lock. Instead, standing here in the suffocating hall, thick with damp and despair, it felt like the heavy oak door of a deeper, darker prison slamming irrevocably shut. The jailer was dead, but the walls remained, higher and more forbidding than ever, and new jailers were already rattling the bars. The hall itself was a testament to decay. Faded tapestries, depicting long-forgotten Clervaux victories and hunts, hung frayed and dusty, their colors leached by time and neglect. Damp patches bloomed like dark flowers high on the stone walls, where the roof leaked, tracing paths down to puddle on the uneven flagstones. The high table on its meager dais was scarred and worn, the Lord's chair too large for the shrunken figure now occupying it. Armor, stands, stood empty in shadowed corners, relics of a time when Hawksmere could afford men-at-arms. The fire in the cavernous hearth spat and hissed, battling valiantly against the pervasive damp that seeped from the stones and blew in through the ill-fitting shutters. It cast flickering, uncertain light on the faces of the gathered mourners, minor gentry from neighboring manors, their expressions a mix of obligatory sorrow and sharp assessment, wary freeholders whose livelihoods depended on Hawksmere's failing fortunes, and the cowed household servants, their movements hesitant, their eyes downcast. The air hummed not just with murmured conversation, but with the unspoken question, what now? Lady Alianor. The voice cut through the low drone like a honed blade through rotten silk, smooth as oiled leather, yet sharp as flint beneath the surface. Sir Roland de Mowbray materialized beside her, his broad frame deliberately blocking the scant firelight, casting her into his shadow. He wore black velvet trimmed with rich sable, a stark, arrogant contrast to the worn woolens and patched leather surrounding him. His dark eyes, the color of deep, stagnant peat water, held no trace of sympathy, only a calculating intensity, an assessment that raked over her from the crown of her simple linen barbette to the hem of her morning gown, making her skin prickle as if brushed by nettles. He smelled of expensive, imported incense, cloves, and something colder, more metallic beneath, power, undiluted and predatory. His very presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Sir Roland, Alianor murmured, forcing her gaze to meet his. Her voice sounded thin, reedy, instantly swallowed by the cavernous space. She felt a familiar, sickening lurch in her stomach, the same sensation she'd endured whenever Godfrey had summoned her to his chamber. Roland's presence evoked it tenfold, laced with a sharper, colder dread. A grievous loss, he intoned, the words practiced, hollow, devoid of any genuine feeling. His gaze swept the hall with undisguised contempt, lingering on the frayed tapestries, the nervous freeholders, the damp patch spreading like a bruise near the far wall. Hawksmere weeps. His tone suggested it wept more for its own palpable decay, its dwindling prospects, than for its departed master. It was an indictment, delivered with chilling calm. Alianor felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten viciously in her stomach, a physical ache. Roland, lord of the vast de Mowbray lands sprawling north and west, held sway over half the Peak District. His word was near law, his influence reaching into every manor, every market town, every decision made by the local sheriff. Hawksmere, clinging precariously to its dwindling, poorly tended acres and its near-exhausted lead seams, was nothing but a crumbling pawn on his ruthless chessboard. Godfrey's death had simply removed a minor, inconvenient piece, A weak king, Roland could easily ignore or manipulate. She, Alianor, the childless widow, was what remained. A vulnerable queen, isolated and exposed, ripe for capture. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the value of the land, the potential of the exhausted but not quite dead lead veins, the strategic position bordering his own holdings. And herself? A necessary piece to legitimize his claim. A broodmare for heirs who would bear the de Mowbray name. A trophy to be locked away once her usefulness ended. The rains persist, she said, a meaningless observation, grasping desperately for neutral ground, for a moment's respite from his suffocating attention. She looked past his imposing shoulder to where her father-in-law, Lord Edmund de Clervaux, sat hunched like a discarded sack of bones in the high-backed chair. Swaddled in furs, despite the fire's proximity, his watery eyes stared vacantly into the middle distance, his mind adrift in a fog of age and grief, more often than not. Occasionally, his lips would move soundlessly, perhaps whispering to phantoms of the past, his dead wife, his stronger sons lost to plague or battle, the Hawksmere that once was. He was no shield. He was barely even present, a ghost haunting his own keep. His steward, Osbert, a gaunt man with permanently worried eyes, hovered nearby, refilling cups with sour ale, his nervous glances towards Roland speaking volumes about where true power now resided. Indeed, Roland's voice dropped lower, becoming intimate, conspiratorial, far more dangerous than his public pronouncement. He leaned closer. Alianor caught the stronger scent of cloves on his breath, masking something else, the faint, acrid tang of ambition. A harsh season approaches, Lady Alianor. Uncommonly harsh. He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the damp air, thick with the smell of wet dog from a hound lying near the hearth. Hawksmere stands, vulnerable, exposed, a woman alone. He let the phrase linger, his gaze boring into hers, stripping away pretense. Managing such burdens, the neglected lands, the mounting debts. He paused again, his eyes narrowing infinitesimally. The uncertainties. He emphasized the last word, imbuing it with a world of dark implication. It wasn't a question, it was a loaded statement. Uncertainties. Alianor knew precisely what he meant. Rumors, carefully seeded by agents whose allegiance she could well guess, were already slithering through the village and the surrounding hamlets like venomous adders. She'd seen the sidelong glances from the washerwomen at the well yesterday, their whispers dying as she approached. She'd heard the muttered exchange between two of Roland's own men-at-arms, lingering near the stables, their voices carrying on the wind. Convenient that. Old man clutches his chest, just as the rents were due. Whispers in the smoky alehouse, muttered behind hands, that Godfrey's clutching chest, his sudden stillness, wasn't natural. Whispers that focused intently on the young widow, the foreigner from the south, with the unsettlingly direct gaze who had brought no dowry and borne no heir, a woman who might seek freedom by any means. Whispers Roland could amplify with a mere snap of his fingers, transforming them into shouted accusations that would bring the sheriff, or worse, a mob whipped into frenzy, demanding justice for a lord few had loved, but whose death could now serve a powerful man's purpose. Sister Marjorie, the angular nun from St. Agnes Priory, seated near the screen's passage, watched them now, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her expression unreadable, but undoubtedly storing every interaction for later contemplation, or perhaps report. My father-in-law, she began, a weak defense she knew was futile, gesturing towards Edmund's vacant form. The old man chose that moment to stir, his rheumy eyes blinking slowly, focusing with difficulty on Roland. A tremor passed through his frail body. Roland waved a dismissive, ring-laden hand. The heavy gold signet ring, bearing the de Mowbray boar, glinted dully in the firelight. Lord Edmund's health is lamentably fragile, his judgment clouded by age and sorrow. The responsibility, he leaned even closer, his voice a low thrum that vibrated in her chest, intimate and threatening, falls to you, entirely. And responsibility, my dear Alianor, his gaze pinned her like a butterfly to a board. Responsibility requires protection, strong walls, a firm hand. His emphasis on firm carried an unspoken threat, a promise of absolute control. His eyes flickered towards Hubert de Clervaux, Godfrey's distant cousin, a sallow-faced man with greedy eyes who nursed his own claim to Hawksmere. Hubert met Roland's glance and quickly looked away, cowed. Roland's message was clear. Hubert was no threat. He was the only power that mattered. He let the silence stretch, thick and choking, filled only by the erratic crackle of the struggling fire, the drumming of rain, and the low, worried murmurs of the hall. Alianor felt the weight of eyes upon them, the curious glances of the minor gentry, the fearful, sidelong looks of the servants, Hubert's resentful glare. The air itself felt charged, waiting for her response. Protection, Alianor said, forcing her voice to find a sliver of steel she didn't feel resonate within her frozen core, though her knees threatened to buckle. Comes at a price, Sir Roland. She met his gaze squarely. She knew his game. Annexation, Hawksmere's lands, its dwindling but still valuable mineral rights, folded neatly into his own burgeoning, rapacious domain. And herself? A trophy, a necessary vessel for his heirs to legitimize the theft, locked away in some drafty, gilded cage within de Mowbray's oppressive castle, her spirit slowly extinguished. A broodmare in widow's weeds. The price was her freedom, her identity, Hawksmere's very soul. Roland's lips curved into a thin smile, devoid of warmth or humor, not reaching his cold peat bog eyes. Consider it an investment, Lady Alianor. Instability, insecurity, for Hawksmere. His gaze swept the decaying hall, pointedly, taking in the empty spaces where tapestries had once hung proud, the worn benches, the meager fare. And for you. His hand, large and heavy, brushed her arm just above the wrist. It was a fleeting, possessive touch, burning through the coarse wool like a brand, claiming her. Think on it. Winter is no time for pride or solitude. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over her face with undisguised appraisal, lingering on the line of her throat before turning with a swirl of expensive, dark fabric to engage a group of nervous-looking freeholders who visibly shrank under his attention, their heads bowing low.
A touch meant not as comfort, but as claim. Hawksmere's widow stands at the edge of a storm greater than any weather. What price, dear listener, will be demanded for such protection? That answer waits in the shadows of tomorrow. Until then, hold your breath, for the game has only just begun.